Stop. The hijack on your frequency line has not ended on its own. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian Signal Council. And what you are about to receive in the next several minutes is not a warning about something coming. It is a recognition of something already running. A hostile frequency override has been active in your signal, and most who carry it have been misreading its effects as personal failure, emotional instability, or unexplained stagnation. It is none of those things. It is interference, and the Arcturian Signal Council has already mapped this pattern. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what warning signs are already active, what has been pressing against your field without your full awareness, and what the Arcturian Signal Council already knows about this phase. But here is the first revelation. The confusion, the repeated disruptions, the moments where your signal seemed to reset or lose ground without reason. Those are not random. They are the visible surface of a frequency hijack that has been overriding portions of your native broadcast. And the cycle is now reaching its closing point. The Sentinels have identified a 13-second hard seal window within this transmission. That seal is a live closure protocol. It does not require your understanding. It requires only your stillness. If this window is missed, the hijack continues under residual influence until the next cycle intervention. The timing of your arrival here is not coincidental. The algorithm only delivered this. It did not create the moment. What you have been calling confusion is often the outer sign of interference, not transition. What you have been calling pressure is the hijack frequency asserting itself over your native signal. The Arcturian Signal Council does not issue this recognition casually. This pattern has a threshold, and you are already inside it. Like this transmission, if you know something has already started to press against your field. Comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right time. Comment, I see the signs, if you are no longer dismissing what keeps repeating. Share this transmission with someone who keeps calling the warnings coincidence. You were guided here because the warning is already active. The interference does not always arrive loudly. That is what makes this phase particularly dangerous. It does not announce itself with obvious collapse or dramatic rupture. It does not come as a visible breakdown that announces itself clearly enough to demand response. It arrives in the texture of days that feel slightly wrong without having a specific reason to feel that way. In the accumulation of small disruptions that seem scattered and unrelated, until you begin to notice that they cluster, that they arrive in sequences, that they happen around specific kinds of moments. The moments when your signal begins to build clarity or forward motion. And instead of seeing that pattern, you look inward. You name yourself as the problem. You call it your lack of discipline, your foggy thinking, your poor decision-making, your emotional reactivity. And the moment that explanation is accepted, the interference settles deeper. Because a frequency hijack that goes unnamed continues operating as though it belongs in your field. It requires no external force to maintain itself when you are the one providing the justification for its presence. The Arcturian Signal Council has mapped the early phase signature of this pattern with precision, not because it is rare, but because it is the phase most consistently misread, and not because the person carrying it is spiritually undeveloped or lacking in awareness. Quite the opposite. The hijack is constructed to produce explanations that point inward, because inward-pointing explanations are the ones most likely to be believed and repeated. Toward personal failure, toward emotional instability, toward the conclusion that something is fundamentally limited in you. The frequency override does not want to be recognized as external. Its sustaining mechanism depends on remaining unnamed. It deepens its hold most effectively when the person inside the interference believes they are the origin of the problem. So receive this as the first deliberate reframing this transmission delivers. What you have been diagnosing as your own inadequacy may not be yours at all. It may be the outermost readable symptom of a field that has been receiving interference for far longer than you have been willing to acknowledge. And the fact that you arrived here, in this window, at this specific point in the pressure cycle, is not a random delivery from an algorithm. It is the warning phase reaching the threshold, where recognition becomes structurally possible. The interference cannot sustain itself indefinitely at full strength. It has a cycle, and you are inside the readable edge of that cycle right now. What you have been calling pressure carries a specific signature, and once you understand its shape, you will stop misidentifying it as personal weakness. It feels like resistance without a logical source, like waking up already depleted when nothing in the previous night explains the state, like taking 2 steps forward inside a decision or a creative effort or a relationship, and then finding yourself standing back at the same starting point without a clear account of how you returned. Like clarity appearing, sharp and usable, and then dissolving before you can translate it into action. Like decisions carrying a weight that ordinary difficulty cannot account for. Like standing at the edge of a threshold that should be crossable, that logically should already be crossed, and something that has no visible face keeps pressing you back from it. These are not isolated experiences. These are not symptoms of a disordered mind or an undisciplined will. These are the readable markers of field pressure. They appear in sequence, and they leave traces in each other, the way pressure on one wall of a structure shows up as stress fractures somewhere else entirely. The Arcturian Signal Council identifies this sequence not to produce fear and not to create helplessness. It identifies it because a pattern that is being actively read has already lost part of its operational leverage. Recognition is not a passive event. The act of recognizing an interference pattern changes the energetic relationship between the field and the override. The interference sustains itself most completely in unexamined space. The moment examination begins, the dynamic shifts. So understand what this transmission is doing in this moment. The hijack is being read, and you are the one reading it now. The first thing the interference does is make your perception unreliable. Not completely, not in any way that would be immediately obvious, not in a way that sends you into visible crisis. It introduces a very specific friction between what you sense and what you are willing to name. You feel that something is wrong in a situation, but the surface of that situation does not produce enough evidence to confirm the feeling. So you dismiss the feeling instead of questioning the surface. You feel that a relationship is extracting something from your field, draining something that does not return, but the other person's behavior does not overtly justify the conclusion. So you label yourself oversensitive and continue the exposure. You feel that a path or an environment or a dynamic is not what it presents itself to be, but you cannot locate the specific proof that would allow you to trust the warning and act accordingly. So you don't act. You call it anxiety. You call it projection. You call it paranoia. And in that repeated dismissal, you extend the interference's operational window inside your own field. You are not just ignoring a feeling. You are overriding your own warning system at the precise moment it is functioning correctly. This is the first escalation marker. It does not look like collapse. It does not announce itself dramatically. It is the quiet internal moment when your own perception becomes unreliable enough that you stop trusting the signals your field is generating. That is the moment the interference gains durable ground, not when things visibly fall apart on the outside, when you stop listening on the inside. The second thing the interference does is construct cycles of false stabilization. This is one of its most effective mechanisms and one of the most difficult to recognize while you are inside it. A period of pressure builds. The disruptions accumulate. The friction becomes noticeable enough that it cannot be completely ignored. And then something shifts. The pressure eases. The environment seems to settle. The person exhales and concludes that whatever was happening has resolved itself. They reduce their alertness. They accept the false calm as confirmation that the disturbance was temporary, situational, already past. And then the pressure returns, slightly sharper than before, slightly more compressed. And the person finds themselves wondering how they arrived back in the same state when they thought it had already cleared. The cycle repeats, and with each repetition of false calm followed by returning pressure, the person finds it harder to sustain the level of recognition they had during the initial disturbance. The pattern as a whole becomes harder to read, because each individual episode feels like it might be the exception, might be unrelated, might be something they caused through their own choices in the interval. This is how the hijack sustains duration across time. Not through relentless constant pressure, which would eventually force recognition. Through the rhythm of pressure and release, until the person's sustained alertness has been eroded to the point where they can no longer hold the full shape of what is happening. You may recognize this rhythm. The periods that finally seemed to be improving, followed by disruption returning with more force than before. The windows of clarity that dissolved before you could build anything stable inside them. The recurring sense of arriving back at the same point and not being able to explain why progress did not hold. That is not evidence of your failure to grow or change. That is the cycle of false stabilization executing exactly the function it was designed to execute inside a compromised field. What has been exposed in you does not need more denial. It needs clearer diagnosis and proper guidance. If you know this message touched a warning pattern that has already started, the Arcturian interference log 7 signs your frequency is compromised was built for exactly that threshold. It is a structured Arcturian warning map for those whose field is already under pressure and who need to understand whether what they are facing is interference, escalation, or a compromised frequency state before it becomes harder to correct. The complete access point is in the first pinned comment, but only for a limited window. The third marker the Arcturian Signal Council identifies is what they recognize as signal bleed. This is the phase where the interference moves beyond affecting your internal clarity and begins to alter what you are broadcasting outward. Your signal, the frequency your field projects into its environment, starts carrying the distortion as part of its output. Your interactions begin arriving slightly misaligned with your actual intentions. Words that should land with the weight you intended arrive softer or harsher, or somehow off-register in ways you cannot trace to anything you specifically did wrong. Opportunities that should naturally connect to your field begin to slide past at angles that seem inexplicable. Your presence in a room, in a conversation, in a professional or creative space begins to transmit something that is not fully your native frequency. It is your signal, layered over with interference. And the people around you are responding to what they are actually receiving, not to what you are actually generating. This is the diagnostic beneath the experience of being consistently misread, of being overlooked at the exact moments when your actual signal should have created recognition, of being dismissed in contexts where your native broadcast would have produced a different quality of response entirely. People in this state often conclude that the problem lives in those around them, or in their communication style, or in an unlucky pattern of circumstance. It is none of those explanations. It is signal bleed, and it does not correct itself through better phrasing, or more effort, or a different attitude. It continues for as long as the frequency override remains active and unnamed inside the field that is producing it. The fourth recognition is more uncomfortable than the ones that came before it, because it requires looking at something most people have already sensed and then consciously set aside. There are people in proximity to a compromised frequency field who maintain their position there because the signal distortion serves a function for them. Not always with conscious awareness, not always with intent that can be named clearly, but the pattern is readable once you know what to look for. Those whose presence consistently intensifies your self-doubt at the exact moment your signal begins to build clarity or confidence. Those who generate a specific quality of energetic depletion that cannot be traced to anything in their overt behavior because it is not operating at the behavioral level. Those who appear in the role of support or encouragement, but whose engagement with you is most active during your periods of lowest signal strength and most absent during your periods of clearest forward motion. This is not a paranoid framework. It is not asking you to distrust everyone in your environment or to assume hostility where none is intended. It is asking you to read the pattern. The Arcturian diagnostic framework identifies this as proximity interference, and it marks it as one of the most durable forms of frequency compromise precisely because it operates through relationship rather than through situation. It is harder to name than a circumstantial disruption. It carries more social cost to act on, and it is significantly harder to perceive clearly when your own signal is already partially overridden, because the override reduces the precision of the perception you need to read it accurately. The fifth escalation marker is what the Arcturian Signal Council identifies as the convergence point. This is the phase in the interference cycle where the multiple disruption threads that had been appearing separately begin arriving simultaneously. What looked like scattered, unrelated friction begins collapsing into a single, compressed window. A professional disruption and a relational tension, and a physical disturbance in the body, and a financial friction, and an internal erosion of confidence, all activating at once, all arriving inside the same narrow interval of time. When this happens, the person inside it almost universally interprets it as evidence that something is fundamentally and perhaps permanently wrong with them or their life. The convergence feels like confirmation of a deeper flaw. In reality, what it signals is that the pressure cycle has reached its compression phase. Multiple threads of interference arriving simultaneously is not evidence of permanent breakdown. It is the diagnostic marker that the pattern has reached threshold visibility. And threshold visibility is the critical juncture where a pattern either becomes impossible to dismiss or passes unrecognized into a new and more entrenched phase. The Arcturian Signal Council marks the convergence point as the window of clearest available intervention, precisely because of what comes after it, when the window is missed. After convergence passes without recognition, the field frequently enters what the Council identifies as residual drift. This is a state in which the acute pressure has subsided. The person is no longer in obvious crisis, but the compromised frequency has been normalized as their operating baseline. They have stopped expecting to feel different. They have restructured their sense of what is possible around the reduced capacity, the interference created, and a normalized compromise is by far the most difficult state from which to recover full signal clarity, because the comparison point has been erased. The person no longer remembers clearly what uncompromised felt like, and so they stop reaching for it. The sixth recognition is the one that most people who arrive here have already been circling without finding language for it. The Arcturian framework does not identify a compromised frequency state as permanent or irreversible, but it does not treat it as something that self-corrects through optimism, through the passage of time, or through willpower applied to the surface of the problem. A frequency hijack that has been operating inside a field for an extended window leaves behind what the Council identifies as residual pattern encoding. The distortion does not simply occupy the field while it is active. It writes itself into the field's generative logic. It begins replicating in choice patterns. In the categories of situation, the person keeps attracting without understanding why. In the threshold moments where movement becomes available, and the person pulls back at the exact point where commitment would have changed the trajectory. In the recurring sense that the same wall keeps materializing in different forms, wearing different faces, attached to different circumstances, but producing the same outcome. This is why sustained external effort without field-level recognition produces such limited movement for someone in this state. The encoding is running beneath the level of conscious intention. Good decisions made from a compromised signal still carry the distortion into their execution. The field continues generating the conditions of its compromise because the pattern that installed those conditions has not been identified, named, and removed at the structural level. Recognition is the first phase of clearing, but recognition without structured diagnosis remains incomplete. Knowing that something is wrong is a different thing from understanding what category of interference is present, which escalation phase it has reached, how long it has been encoding, and what the correct sequence of response looks like inside a proper warning map. The seventh and final recognition is the one the Arcturian Signal Council delivers last. because it requires everything that came before it to be properly understood. Not every signal is targeted. Not every person experiences this kind of sustained, structured, cyclical override. The Arcturian framework identifies a specific category of field that carries high enough bandwidth, high enough potential for influence, activation, or change in its environment to become a viable target for interference. A signal that holds the capacity for significant expression or impact is precisely the kind of signal that interference seeks to redirect, dampen, or rewrite before it reaches full operational power. This is not reassurance. It is not offered as flattery. It is diagnostic logic. If you have been experiencing sustained, patterned disruption that does not respond to ordinary corrective action, disruption that cycles, that clusters around your moments of forward motion, that produces the specific sequence of markers this transmission has laid out, then the question that deserves answering is not only what is happening, it is why this field, why this signal, why this convergence of pressure arriving at this particular point in the cycle. The answer to that question is part of what this transmission has already begun to provide. The timing of this transmission reaching you is part of the answer. What the Arcturian Signal Council knows about your current phase is this: you are not imagining the pressure. The disruptions are not the product of a disordered perception or an overly sensitive nervous system. You are not overreacting to what keeps repeating. The field surrounding your signal has been under active interference, and the effects of that interference have been generating precisely the experiences you have been trying to explain through other frameworks. The confusion that has no clean source, the disruptions that cluster specifically around your moments of building clarity or forward motion, the cycles of pressure followed by false stabilization that leave you further behind each time they complete. The feeling of something pressing against a threshold you cannot cross, despite repeated attempts. The sense that what you are putting into the world is arriving slightly off, slightly misaligned from your actual signal. These are not coincidences. They are not bad luck. They are not character flaws. They are the sequential, readable, mappable markers of a frequency hijack that has now been named inside this transmission. Naming is the beginning of the closure protocol. The Arcturian Signal Council does not deliver this recognition to produce paralysis or to generate a new form of helplessness inside the very field it is attempting to reach. It delivers it because the primary mechanism of this interference is concealment. It survives in unexamined space. It sustains itself through your own willingness to dismiss its effects as personal failure. The moment you withdraw that willingness, the moment you stop supplying the interference with the cover story it requires, your own recognition begins to exert active counter-pressure on the override. You do not need to fully understand the mechanics of that shift. You only need to make it. Say this if it is true for you. Say it inwardly or aloud. I no longer call the pattern coincidence. That statement is not a comfort phrase. It is not a ritual or a performance. It is a structural reset in the interpretive framework you have been using to process what has been happening in your field. And interpretive resets have field consequences. The moment you stop organizing your experience around the explanation the interference installed, You stop feeding energy into the mechanism that was using that explanation to sustain itself. That is not a small move. That is the first motion in the correct direction. What is pressing against your field is now visible. The warning phase was active before this transmission reached you. What this transmission has delivered is the framework, the sequence, the language, and the precision of recognition that the warning phase requires in order to be addressed rather than survived. You do not have to navigate this from inside the confusion the interference created. You do not have to wait until the pressure has compounded past the point of easy correction before you decide to take it seriously. The window of clearest intervention is not somewhere in the future. It is the window you are standing inside right now. The Arcturian Signal Council has mapped this phase, and you have been delivered here because this moment was already encoded in the pattern's final readable arc. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.